everybody, welcome to the next mini lecture in this module. Dr. Bianchi here, and today we're going to be spending some time examining the cortex, that outer layer of the brain that many have argued makes humans who they are. So today we'll be looking at more depth at the cortex and learning more about the different components, the different lobes, and what's basically going on with the cortex. So, for those of you who are not familiar, the cortex is this thin outer covering of the brain that's critical for human cognition and for complex behavior. Now, you may be familiar with the fact that the cortex can be split into two hemispheres, okay, the left and the right hemisphere, each of which have 4 lobes or sections that handle different types of information. So let's go ahead and look at those lobes. Okay, here are the 4 major lobes of the brain. Okay, we have our frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal lobes. Now let me just spend a few seconds giving you the general breakdown of what these regions of the cortex are doing. All the way in the back of the brain, we have the occipital lobe. Now it's pretty counterintuitive that most of your visual data, most of the information coming in through your eyes gets sent all the way to the back of the brain and is processed back here in the occipital lobe, home to visual cortex, critical for your perception of the world around you in a visual sense. Moving over to the temporal lobe here in purple, we know that this sits right above the ears and is really critical for the processing of auditory information. Later in the class, we'll also look at how some of the subcortical structures in the temporal lobe are important for advanced forms of learning and memory. Up here, we have the parietal lobe in this green section here. This is really important for knowing where your body is in space and processing what we call somatosensory information. Okay, information coming from the senses and information coming in through your body. The frontal lobe is all the way up here. Now, many of you may be aware that the frontal lobe is important for planning ahead, higher abstract forms of thinking, inhibiting impulses, just more advanced cognitive processes. So these are the general, this is the general overview of the 4 major lobes of the brain. We can also see that there are distinct sections of the cortex that are really critical for language. Okay, we know that language in the brain is typically dominant in the left hemisphere. Now, here's an area known as Broca's area. Broca's area is really important for your ability to produce language, okay, to speak and produce language on a day-to-day basis. If you have damage to this area, you would have what's called Broca's aphasia. Okay, aphasia means the loss of language, and you would have problems producing language. Wernicke's area here in light blue is another key language area in the cortex, but this area is responsible for your ability to comprehend language. Okay, so your ability to read or understand what people are saying is heavily dependent on Wernicke's area. Damage to Wernicke's area would be known as Wernicke's aphasia, and you would have problems comprehending language. So notice that we have distinct regions of the cortex involved in language, and that there's this distinction between the production of language and the actual comprehension of language. Okay, and here in dark blue we have primary auditory cortex situated between those 2 areas. As you know, right, hearing things on a day-to-day basis is critical for your ability to know what people are saying and to participate in conversations. So when we look at the cortex, we can basically divide this into 3 main areas in a sense. Sensory cortex is involved in taking information from the outside environment via your senses. So every day you're walking around, you're smelling things, you're seeing things with your eyes, you're touching and interacting with the environment. As that information progresses through your sensory systems, it gets registered by different parts of the brain. Motor cortex is part of the cortex responsible for directing behavior. So if I put my hand on a hot stove or if I touch something in my environment, right, my sensory systems are going to register that in my brain, and then I'm going to pick up the remote to change the slides, or I'm going to take my hand off of this uncomfortable surface. Okay, motor cortex is about movement and behavior. All of the rest of cortex that doesn't have a sensory or motor function is known as association cortex. Now we'll be looking more in depth at the cortex as the semester goes on, but these are just some of the basics. Now you may or may not know that your body is actually represented in your brain. There's different amounts of cortical tissue devoted towards representing your body. Now over here on the right, in blue, we have what's known as the sensory cortex, okay, or the sensory strip. This actually sits up in the parietal lobe, which we just talked about, really important for knowing where your body is in space. The sensory cortex devotes cortical tissue to different aspects of your body. Now, parts of your body that are more sensitive or play a bigger role in picking up the environment around you have more cortical tissue devoted to that part. So you can see there's a large amount of cortical tissue for the face, okay, the hands, right? Touching things in our environment is critical for knowing what's going on. And you can see that the map basically dedicates space, cortical tissue, depending on how important it is for you to experience sensations from that body part. Okay, so this is known as sensory cortex, and the body is mapped out on this cortical tissue. Later on in the course, we'll look at what's called phantom limb syndrome, where individuals may lose an arm or they may lose a leg, and we'll actually see the plasticity of the sensory cortex, where different body parts can kind of come in and invade, taking over the cortical space. But that's coming up in a later lecture. Now let's move over here to the left. We're looking at motor cortex. Okay, this is cortical tissue that's devoted towards the initiation of movement in your body. So when your senses pick up information and your brain registers what's going on in your environment, well, now typically you need to behave, you need to do something. That's where motor cortex comes in. Again, we see cortical tissue devoted towards different body parts, okay, depending on how sensitive they are or how often they're involved in movement. Okay, and here's an image of motor cortex on the brain here. So for now, it's important to just realize that your body is mapped out in both your sensory and your motor cortex to facilitate sensory information giving rise to behavior. So how do brain regions consisting of neurons produce behavior? Well, the brain collects information from the environment, it analyzes it, and then it makes decisions about what that information means. Okay, and information is transformed as it moves through the nervous system. So our sensory input goes through various association areas and gives rise to motor output. So let's put a real world example to that. I'm driving in my car and I see a cat in the street and I slam on the brakes because I don't want to run it over. Okay, that seamless feat actually is underpinned by a complex series of maneuvers going on in the brain. Now, when we look across mammals, we'll see that association areas are actually bigger. There's more association areas in the brain when we look at humans compared to chimps, cats, and rats. So one argument that's been made over time is that some of our more complex thinking and behavior as humans may be due to the larger amount of association areas in the cortex. So this is just an interesting comparison across mammals showing that. Now I just want to touch a little bit on how we can examine the brain. In the field of neuroscience, we have all different methods for cutting up the brain and examining the brain. And it's important to be familiar with those different cuts or slices as they're going to be coming up during the class. So right up here, this is what we call a sagittal cut. And basically, you're taking a brain and you're just cutting it down into the left and right hemisphere. Okay, so this is a sagittal image of a brain using imaging technology. Here we have an axial cut, okay, basically separating the brain into the top and bottom. Okay, and this is what an imaging result would look like using an axial technique. Down here we have a coronal slice of the brain. This is going to separate the brain into the front and the back. And here's your typical coronal slice coming out of imaging. So it's important to be familiar with the sagittal, the axial, and the coronal slices of the brain. Again, they're going to be coming up in the course as we proceed, and that way you're always familiar with what angle of the brain you're looking at. So let's go ahead and try a practice question. This example here is what kind of slice of the brain? Is it A, sagittal, coronal, axial, or none of the above? Let me give you a second to think about those options. Now, hopefully, you're realizing that this is a sagittal cut of the brain. Okay, we're basically cutting the brain into the left and right hemisphere. Here you can see the right hemisphere of the brain. Let's try one more. We just looked at an example of an image like this. Okay, this is an example of what kind of slice of the brain. And hopefully you're realizing that this is an axial slice. Okay, we're basically separating the brain into the top and the bottom. Okay, and that's what an imaging result would look like when we do an axial slice or cut of the brain. So to summarize this mini lecture, okay, we've discussed how the cortex is the outer layer of the brain. You should be familiar with the 4 lobes of the brain and their general functions. What kind of data do they handle and process? We've learned that some cortical areas are sensory, others are motor, and the rest are association. Okay, and we've seen how in more complex mammals, there seems to be a larger amount of association cortex. Finally, we looked at how the brain can be cut up into different slices in order to provide different perspectives or views of the brain. So you should be familiar with those different cuts and be able to identify them.